Let's kick things off with a deceptively simple question. Why do names spark so much passion? I mean, people have argued, even fought, over what to call a place or a group. What is it about names that makes them so significant?
You know, it's wild how much we attach to a name. It's not just a label, it's a doorway into how we see ourselves and others. Throughout history, names have helped people communicate, shape reality, and even justify power sometimes to the point where a single word can divide communities or unite them. Without names, we'd have a hard time even describing the world around us.
Totally. And I've noticed that names don't stay fixed. They pick up new meanings, lose old ones, and sometimes even turn into symbols loaded with political or emotional baggage.
Exactly, and that's where language gets slippery. One word can mean something sacred to one group and something totally mundane to another. That's why semiotics, the study of signs and symbols, has gotten so much attention. It helps us unpack why a name can be contentious, especially when different communities interpret it through their own lens.
That actually reminds me, even philosophers like Aristotle and Plato wrestled with the power of words to shape reality. Sometimes it feels like we're still caught up in that debate today.
For sure, Aristotle saw words as tools that could shape feelings, even beliefs. Plato, on the other hand, was more skeptical, seeing emotion as separate from knowledge. But both agreed names are complex, sometimes even sacred. In ancient Greece, for example, names were thought to be a way to contact the divine.
So if names carry all this symbolic weight, it's no wonder they get tangled up with questions of power. How does that play out in history? Can you give us an example where a name became much more than just a word on a map?
One case that jumps to mind is how rulers used names to tie themselves to the gods or legendary heroes. Think about Roman Emperor Commodus calling himself Hercules, or Alexander the Great claiming descent from the same mythic line. By doing that, they weren't just naming themselves, they were building a narrative that gave them almost supernatural authority.
It's like they were trying to rewrite reality, right? And not just for fun, but to actually convince people to accept their rule as legitimate, almost a kind of ancient hyperreality.
That's spot on. And this logic hasn't gone away. In fact, modern leaders often use language in similar ways. With the rise of populism, we see politicians and governments push their own versions of reality, sometimes distorting facts to create a dominant narrative that crowds out alternatives. It's a powerful political tool.
Funny you say that, because the book mentions Umberto Eco's take on hyperreality, where what's fake or exaggerated starts to feel more real than the truth. And once people believe that narrative, it's incredibly hard to shake.
Absolutely. Eco's idea is different from Baudrillard's, though Eco thought there's always a kernel of reality left. That makes it even trickier, since distorted facts can feel convincing, especially when wrapped up in powerful symbols or names. That's how entire communities come to rally behind a shared, sometimes questionable version of reality.
Let's zoom in on territorial names specifically. How do disputes over place names connect to these bigger issues of identity and injustice?
Territorial name disputes are a perfect storm of language, identity, and politics. When two groups use different names for the same place, they're not just arguing over a word, they're expressing deep feelings about who they are, what they value, and what they believe is at stake. It becomes a zero-sum game. Only one version can officially win, so the losing side ends up feeling wronged, and their sense of identity threatened.
That sense of threat can get pretty intense, right? The book even talks about how political actors use security rhetoric, what's called securitization theory, to frame these disputes as existential dangers.
Exactly. Securitization theory basically says that powerful actors, governments, politicians, can shape public opinion by framing something as an urgent threat. With territorial names, this means convincing people that losing the name means losing a piece of their identity or their homeland. It's a recipe for rallying support, but also for deepening divisions.
And sometimes, as the book points out, the fight isn't just over land, but over what that land means. The name itself becomes a symbol of justice or injustice, especially if one side feels like history has been rewritten against them.
That's such a good point. These names become injustice symbols, shortcuts for collective memory and mobilization. Think of examples like the Arab Spring, where certain names Abu Ghraib, Muhammad Bouazizi became rallying cries. Territorial name disputes can work the same way, fueling activism or even conflict.
Alright, so not all name disputes are created equal. The book draws a line between hyperreal and referential symbolic name disputes. Can you unpack that distinction for us?
Sure. Hyperreal disputes revolve around imagined geographies and dogmatic narratives. Here, the symbolic meaning of the name is more important than the actual land. For example, the fight over whether to call a region Macedonia isn't just about territory, it's tied to national myths and identity. The argument becomes about who gets to own the story.
So it's less about drawing borders and more about controlling the narrative. What about referential disputes?
Referential disputes, on the other hand, focus on real, physical territories, think islands, borders, or regions, where the main issue is who controls the land. The symbolic aspects can matter, but they're secondary. For instance, the dispute between Japan and Russia over the Kuril Islands is mostly about who governs the islands, though the names each side uses still matter.
That makes sense. And sometimes, the symbolic side can escalate, especially when politicians or elites keep the dispute alive to serve their own interests.
Exactly. In some cases, it suits political elites to keep a name dispute unresolved. It's a handy tool to rally supporters, distract from other problems, or justify tough policies. The dispute itself starts to take on a life of its own, much bigger than the land in question.
This brings up the million-dollar question. Why do these disputes drag on for years, sometimes decades? What keeps them so stubbornly alive?
Part of it is that once a name is tied to identity and justice, compromise feels like defeat. It's not just a political negotiation, it's emotional. If a narrative has been hammered home for generations, people are deeply invested. Any attempt at resolution can feel like betraying your group or erasing your own history.
And that emotional investment makes it easier for leaders to keep the pot boiling, sometimes deliberately. Like you said earlier, it can be a distraction or a way to build support, even if it means prolonging the conflict.
Exactly, and as a result, the dispute can become almost impossible to solve. Even outside parties looking in often don't grasp why the fight is so fierce because the meaning of the name has become so loaded, so wrapped up in a specific group's sense of self and security.
That's a sobering thought, but maybe, by understanding how these disputes work, how names become symbols, and how narratives are built, we can start to see paths toward dialogue, even if easy fixes aren't on the table.
Absolutely. Just getting people to recognize how much is packed into a single name is a huge step. It opens space for empathy and maybe, one day, more creative solutions.